here. As just mentioned, I'm currently serving as the interim dean for the College of Business. I've been a longtime chair of mechanical engineering, so I've dealt with budgets both at the department level as well as the college level. So hopefully have some different perspective on budgets. And yeah, Jess is going to be monitoring the chat. I'm terrible at doing that while I'm presenting. So if you do have a question, feel free to throw it in there. And then just interrupt me and we'll get any questions answered as we go. So if you have questions along the way, don't hesitate to ask those. So I am going to see if I can get the screen shared to go. And okay, how does that look? Are you able to see my presentation there?
Yep.
Good.
Okay, let me go back to the beginning. Okay, so my goal here is kind of talk about a little bit about the different types of budgets, the different types of funds that we have available, how those funds can be used. There's different rules for different types of funds. And then talk a little bit about just, some tips on how to go about managing budgets, spending, tracking, just kind of other ideas. And I definitely want this to be interactive. So if any of you, again, have questions or comments or, different ideas during the presentation, let's talk about it. Let's feel free to talk about them at that time. So let's first start with just kind of what the different budget sources are. And depending on, what program, what department, what college you're in, you may or may not have, all of these types of funds at your disposal. We'll go through each one in more detail, but basically, state appropriated funds, these are the typical funds that most of you use to fund your salaries, probably not so much operating funds anymore with all the budget cuts that we've been facing. But that tends to be your biggest fund is state appropriations. Some programs have differential tuition, so we'll talk a little bit about what that is and how that money should be spent for those programs that do have DT. Restricted funds, which come from grants and contracts or other types of restricted donations. And then a lot of other kind of local funds, indirect cost returns, which come back from, again, return facilities and overhead costs from grants and contracts, foundation funds, which come about from philanthropy, course and lab fees, which aren't so common anymore, summer school, recharge service centers. So we'll talk about each of these different types of funds as we go through the presentation. So let's start with the state appropriated funds. So this is typically historically where most of our money comes from at the department level, at the college level. And so your state appropriations are funding for most of us the salaries. So that could be salaries of faculty, full-time staff, sometimes some student support for TAs and RAs. You may have lines like pool positions for adjuncts or temporary staff. And the fringe benefits, the nice thing about the state appropriation funds is that the fringe benefits are really covered indirectly. I mean, they're still covered, but they don't show up in your budget, in your budgets. And so whenever you can cover a salary from state appropriations, it's a bonus. If you pay a salary from a non-appropriated fund, you also have to pay the fringe benefits. So that's something that you really want to pay attention to because that can add up quite a bit. In addition to the salaries, you typically have a different line that's your operating funds. Those would be funds that would cover, kind of your departmental operating costs. So that might be supplies, travel, printing, telecommunications, and so on. For most of us, operating funds have not kept up with operating costs. I mean, that's just the way it's gone. There has not typically been much new funds put into operations. And with budget cuts that we've been having the last few years, that's one of the things that some programs have given up, are some of their operating, choosing to find other sources to fund some of the operating costs. So you may or may not have much in the way of operating funds available. Last bullet point there. Sometimes if you do have some extra salary funds, you can sometimes, at the end of the year, you can spend those as operating. Usually it's harder to go the other way, to take what's designated for operating and pay salary out of it. But just sometimes those can be mixed a little bit. Differential tuition is, and I've given you the exact quote right out of the state board policy manual, is how differential tuition is defined. And according to the state, there's not much guidance given as to how differential tuition can be spent. And so that's kind of nice, right? It's basically additional funds, additional money, additional tuition that gets charged to certain programs based on what we call programmatic needs. So at NDSU currently, there's only a select number of programs that charge differential tuition, and that includes engineering and computer science, nursing, business, pharmacy, architecture, and landscape architecture. And there's different rates for each of those programs. My philosophy has always been, and there's a little bit different philosophies on here, but when dealing with differential tuition, this is money that's paid in by students specifically who are enrolled in that program to cover costs that are higher than normal other programs. So for example, in engineering, there's additional costs that are associated because we have a lot of labs, and those are physical labs, computer labs. We have to buy software, we have to buy equipment. So there's a higher cost associated with the delivery of education. So our engineering students pay in a little bit extra in tuition to cover that. The way that money then, since it's being paid in by students, the funds should be used to benefit the academic program, right? So using funds for things like course and lab supplies, equipment that's going to be used in labs that will benefit students, computers, software costs. We use it for student travel. We'll use it to help support TAs and graders for the classes. We might use it to hire adjuncts to teach courses, or staff salaries who are directly supporting students, and so on. So all of those things are going in to benefit the students, and that's what differential tuition should be used for. What it should not be used for, in my view, are things that would perhaps support research programs, the research enterprise, for example, because typically, I guess it depends on program, but in a lot of cases, graduate students aren't paying in differential tuition. Depends on the nature of the program. Some grad programs do pay differential, some do not, but we should use it to support the academic enterprise. And so we just want to be careful in how differential tuition is used in that regard. Restricted funds. So restricted funds would include the category of grants and contracts. So if you have in your program, if you have a lot of research active faculty who are bringing in grants, those will be set up in a restricted fund. And so those funds can only be used for the purpose in which they were obtained, right? So a grant fund can only be used to support activities associated with that particular grant. Most grants and contracts have a defined time frame. They have an established budget, so you have to spend the money not only for the grant purposes, but within the way in which with how the budget was defined. You can do budget redistributions. Most funding agencies will allow that, but that has to typically be okayed by a sponsoring agency. So over time, the grant objectives might change. You can do a budget redistribution as long as it's authorized by that sponsoring agency. Restricted donations also fall within this category of restricted funds. Now, most of our donations, of course, go through the NDSU Foundation. There are times when, for whatever reason, somebody may donate directly to a department or a college and want to bypass the foundation. We try not to encourage that, but sometimes that's what people like to do. They don't want to pay the 5%, gift fee that's charged by the foundation or whatever, so they direct it directly to a program. In that event, then that donation should be sent to our restricted fund accounting group, and a specific restricted fund set up so that it is used for whatever the intended purpose based on whoever's making that donation. So those are kind of special cases. They don't happen a lot, but on occasion that does happen. Also arising out of grants and contracts are the indirect cost returns. So with most funded research, there's direct costs that are determined by the PI that are associated with that grant. On top of those direct costs, then we charge what we call the F&A rate, Facilities and Administrative Cost Rate, which is a negotiated rate with the federal government. And currently that rate is 45% of what's called the modified total direct costs. That includes most of the direct costs. There's a few things that are excluded. Of that 45% that comes to the university, 42% of those indirect costs are returned to the college that generates that grant. Or if there's multiple colleges, if a grant extends across multiple colleges, then there's going to be some kind of negotiated agreement between the colleges to return those IDCs. The IDCs that come into the college, then it's up to the college how those funds are redistributed to the department. So some colleges have a policy where most of the funds that come in, or a percentage of the funds that come in, are then passed back to the department of the PI or co-PIs. Other colleges have more of a policy of that they maintain those funds centrally to be used for the good of the college. And so that's something that you would have to go and ask your dean about as to what the particular college policy is. Regarding the use of IDCs, they're really unrestricted. So there's no specific ways that are defined in how you can spend those. But in theory, they should really be used to support the research enterprise because that's how they are generated. So oftentimes we will use the returned indirects to support, faculty travel for to go to a conference for faculty maybe that don't have research grants, or it can be used for startup funding for new faculty, or it can be used for seed funding for smaller grants in support of a larger proposal, for example. So other ways that we're going to go about to support the research enterprise in the university is really how those indirect costs should be used. Of course, we also have foundation funds. And so foundation funds, this is funds that are generated through philanthropic support. So we just went through NDSU Giving Day yesterday, and we got a lot of money in from our donors. Those funds, that money all goes to the foundation into specific accounts for different departments, programs, other purposes. A lot of it might be scholarship funds, professorships in support of programs. Those funds go to the foundation. And then as we need them at the department level or the college level, we have those funds transferred to into university funds as money is spent. So we can do kind of periodic transfers from the foundation into the university. Usually those are also, what we'd call restricted funds because they're all based on donor intent. So if a donor provides funding to a scholarship, those funds must be used for the scholarship that the donor was donating into. So each foundation fund has an MOU that's defined for it, and that MOU describes how those funds can be used. And we want to be very cognizant of making sure that Those foundation funds are only used for that purpose. We don't want to be violating donor intent. In fact, we can get into big trouble if we start doing that. So we want to be very careful about how those funds are spent. Now, the foundation funds typically there's two different categories. There's what we call directly spendable, or in and out. So money comes in, that money gets spent out. So we can spend it as it's coming in. The other type is an endowment. So those are typically larger funds that if a donor decides to create an endowment, the nice thing about an endowment is that it's going to be here forever, right? Hopefully forever. And basically what we do is we take the principal gets invested by the foundation, and then a consistent rate is kicked off for spending. And currently that rate is right around, I think it's just a hair under 4% is what the foundation is paying off the principal. So that gives you an idea of if you've got an endowment that's got $200,000 into it or whatever it may be, you're going to get on an annual basis about 4% a year for spendable. So it kind of gives you an idea. So we're not spending nearly the amount that's coming in, but on the positive side, it provides an annual revenue stream for us. And then some other funds, and these are just kind of a smattering of different funds that we typically refer to as local funds. Course and lab fees, these have been mostly phased out. I keep them in here because there are still a handful of classes on campus that do charge an additional fee. So those when you've got a course that has a fee associated with it, that money must be spent in support of that specific course. So you can't take this money for one class and spend it for something else. Again, most of those were phased out, but there's a few still that are in use. Summer school. If you have a program that teaches a lot of summer classes and has high enrollments during the summer, all summer school classes must be self-supporting. So there's a minimum enrollment that must occur in order to generate enough tuition revenue to pay for the instructor, plus some overhead. If there is more enrollment beyond what's required to support the class, a portion of that money typically gets returned back to the department. It's not a whole lot, but there is some level of return. So if you can generate high enrollments during the summer, that is a way to make some additional money for your department. And then that money that's returned is unrestricted. That can be used in support of other activities. So that's nice. Recharge centers or service centers are another way to generate some revenue. And this would be for programs that maybe has equipment or provides some sort of support for other units on campus or even off campus. But for example, if you have a department that has some test equipment, research equipment that other departments can use, or off campus other companies or groups off campus can use, you can establish a recharge center. And the intent of that is that you can charge money for the use of the equipment in order to support the operational and maintenance costs for that equipment. For internal use, you're not allowed to set those rates such that you're making a profit. So you're not charging, another department more money in an attempt to make a profit. Although for external use, you can actually have a different rate, which basically it's kind of like it has an overhead associated with it, which actually does allow you to make a little bit of profit. Have to be careful in setting those rates. We're not allowed to compete unfairly with, say, local companies if we're doing the same type of work. But for specialized equipment or specialized services, recharge centers can be a nice way to generate money back for the program, basically to maintain the use of that equipment. Okay, so that's kind of a description of some of the funds that we have available. And so now just kind of more talking about the process of how we can spend those funds and some tips for spending and tracking funds. All of the funds at NDSU are maintained in our PeopleSoft financial module. We typically, most programs, at least currently, maintain separate spreadsheets for the tracking of funds. And the reason for that is because PeopleSoft is not necessarily very user-friendly and very up-to-date. So most of us generate, Excel spreadsheets or other, QuickBooks or whatever software you want to use to have kind of a shadow system. And I know they don't like us to do this, but that's really the only way to kind of keep up to date and to allow you to encumber expenses and plot out for the year what you're expecting to spend. So the account technicians in our department will create the Excel files, set up their budgets, do all the tracking in there, and then periodically go back into the PeopleSoft system to reconcile. And so that needs to be done on a fairly regular basis, let's say a monthly basis, to make sure that what we're tracking internally is in line with what PeopleSoft says that we have available. This is where administrative support is really, really critical, right? Having some good, competent people that can maintain the tracking, do all of the payroll, do the purchasing and accounts payable. This is where just good staff is really valuable, and you're going to see that come up periodically through this presentation. Staff support is very important. Now, in authorizing expenditures, different programs, different colleges do this very differently. And I look at it as kind of a distributed model versus a centralized model. And I've kind of worked within both types of models. A distributed model is one where faculty, sometimes students, but you would typically think of faculty or research staff can initiate their own purchases. So for example, some departments will issue a lot of faculty and staff a purchasing card so that they can actually just go out and make their own purchases directly, or use personal funds and then submit for reimbursement. From a faculty staff standpoint, that's convenient, right? Because it puts the expense in, or it puts the convenience into the faculty that they can go and kind of spend the money as they want. The problem with that is the accountability side, right? Because we need to have receipts turned in. We need to have kind of a paper trail of how things are being spent. Sometimes, to be honest, faculty aren't always great about, keeping track of how much money they have left in their grant. And so sometimes they overspend or underspend. So the accountability side can be a little bit of a problem. So it's more convenient, but it's from a traceability, trackability standpoint, not as great. The more centralized model would be one where all of your purchases are initiated only by authorized individuals. So your account technician, for example. So if a faculty needs to purchase something as part of their grant, one of the processes we've used in engineering is we have a pre-order form. Faculty member fills that out, submits it to the account tech, and then the account tech does the ordering and the paying. Less convenient for faculty. There's some more paperwork involved. But much easier for the accountability and tracking of expenditures. So these are things that obviously you would have to work out, within your own units. But there's pros and cons to both sides of those.
I have a question in the chat for you.
Sure.
The budget process starts with a unit submitting a budget for the upcoming fiscal year. If new funding is requested by a unit in the budget request, who decides if it is approved or not? Please answer for a unit that is a department and a unit that is a college.
So I think what you're referring to, I hope I'm getting this right, is like on the appropriated funding, the annual allotment that's given to each unit at the beginning of the year, new fiscal year. So historically, that we've operated by what we call a historical model, where basically this is the amount you got last year, this is the amount you're getting next year, right? And with maybe a small increase to account for inflation. So that's how those budgets are handed down to the colleges. And usually that's what's consisting of your salaries and your operating funds. So you don't, to be honest, I mean, you don't have a whole lot of choice in what that budget amount is. This is what you're getting. And now figure out how you're going to make your annual budget work within that amount that you've been given for the on the appropriated side. So you might submit a budget that's way higher than what you spent last year, but you're still going to get the same amount of money as what you got last year. Now, again, from college to college, that might differ in how the college distributes funds to the department. So each college may choose to do that differently. I know in engineering, it was, again, the departments got the kind of the same allotment each year. It's more of a distributed budget to the departments in the College of Engineering. In the College of Business, the dean's office actually controls most of the funds that come in and makes and then it's up to your dean and the chairs as to how funds get distributed down. So again, I can't answer specifically for one specific college over another because everyone does that a little bit differently. Now, coming up, we've been hearing a lot about the new tuition incentivized budget model that's going to be introduced starting next year. It's still going to be kind of the same type of allotment that you're going to get a certain amount, but the amount that each college gets is going to be based on the tuition revenue collected from the previous year and the projection into the current year. And well, so it's based on, a combination of enrollments and student credit hours generated. So the nice thing about this is that now we're going to have a little more control of our own destiny, in that if we can grow our own enrollments, we'll get more money each year. All right, once this model is fully implemented. Of course, if your enrollments decline, you're going to get less money. So you have to, now it's going to make us very cognizant of what our enrollments are and how many student credit hours that we're generating. But again, the amount that's allocated to each college is going to be a set amount based on a combination of enrollments and student credit hours. Did that answer the question for who asked that? All right. Well, we'll keep going, and then if there's more questions on that, please continue to ask. Okay. Audits. So this is, again, something we got to be aware of, that our funds are periodically audited, and especially what I call internal audits. And this happens very, very frequently, to be honest, from our grant and contract accounting group, because grants and contracts have very specific ways in which the money can be spent, right? It has to be spent in accordance with the budget and in accordance with the rules set by the funding agency. So it is not at all uncommon when you've got a lot of grant activity that our grant and contract accounting GCA office will come back and do an audit, and they'll say, hey, you had this expenditure on this item. Can you produce the receipts or whatever it is that they're looking for? They just want to, and this is kind of a random, but they will want to make sure that those expenditures are allowable on the grant, and that you've got the necessary documentation proving that expense was made. So just be aware, it's not anything, they're not just trying to it's not a gotcha situation, but they're just trying to make sure that we're spending money in accordance with the rules. So the key on that is to make sure that you're always maintaining proper documentation. So every purchase has to have a receipt. Every travel reimbursement has to have a receipt associated with it. And And it's not at all uncommon for reimbursements to get kicked back. It happens a lot on travel because we don't have, the required documentation. If you go to a conference, you have to make sure that you have some sort of evidence that the conference actually took place over these dates. Were there meals included in the conference, because you can't charge for a meal per diem that's included as part of the conference. So there's a lot of checking that goes on with that. That's okay. I mean, just understand that that's going to happen. And so documentation on these types of things is incredibly important. So that's all internal, right? Kind of auditing that goes on. And periodically we have external audits. So this might be something, for example, that comes from the state auditor's office, where they decide they want to look at a particular type of funding or a program. So I've been involved in this as chair of mechanical engineering, where we've had the state auditor's office come in and look at the past 2 years, past 3 years of all of our differential tuition spending. And you got to go back and produce, all of the history over that time period. You've got to be ready to produce, receipts and documentation. Those types of audits typically are much broader in scope, much deeper. And you just, sometimes they happen. And so you have to be ready for that. Again, for all of this purpose, administrative support is just critical. So having good account technicians, budget managers, people to make sure that we're following the proper spending and keeping all of that documentation is just very critical for these purposes. So be aware of that. On the spending side, just some general rules when we're dealing with appropriated funding. Appropriated funds have to be spent down on an annual basis. So our fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th. And so you want to make sure that in your spending, that you're monitoring, that you're watching it, so that you can spend all of that money down by June 30th, right? Because whatever doesn't get spent down then gets swept back. So that's the key one, that you're not really allowed to carry over funds. Although I've seen that with the new budget model, there may be some percentage carryover that's allowed. I'm not sure on that, don't quote me, but there may be slightly different rules that come into play when the new budget model comes out. But as a rule, spend your appropriated funds down, take them to zero at the end of the year. For salary, I think I mentioned this, but when paying salaries, whenever possible, use appropriated funds as opposed to other funding sources, differential tuition, local funds, and so on. Because if you use any other type of fund, not appropriated, you have to pay the fringe benefits out of that. And those fringe benefits can add up to be a lot. For full-time faculty, full-time staff, typically range from about 30 to 50%, depending on what their salary level is additional cost to you. So if you're paying somebody out of differential tuition as a student support specialist, recognize that not only do you have to pay the salary, but you're going to pay somewhere between 30 to 50% additional for fringe benefits. So that has to be accounted for. If you're paying out of appropriated funds, those fringe benefits are paid out of that kind of that behind the scenes pool. And so you don't have to budget that. So that's a definite advantage for using appropriated funding to pay salaries. For other funds, not appropriated, the rule is also to kind of avoid carrying large balances across fiscal years. The university doesn't like this. The problem is if legislators look, and we're saying that we're in the middle of budget cutting, we need more funding, and they look at our balances and they see these large balances in local funds that we're carrying across from year to year, those can add up. You look at all of the local funds across the university, and if you've got a few $1 million sitting there, they're saying you don't need money. You got a lot of money right there. Now that's, of course, that's tricky because sometimes we want to carry a balance across a fiscal year because maybe we're trying to save up to buy a piece of equipment. And so we need to save up a couple of years of funds in order to buy that. Okay, that's fine. We just need to be able to justify that. So if there is some reason why you need to carry a large balance across the fiscal year, be prepared to justify that to your dean or to the provost level as to why you've got this balance that's being carried across. As far as again, budget spending, as a chair, as a director, as a dean, I try to operate under the policy of openness and transparency. I don't think hiding, what we're spending or why we're spending or how we're spending it is not a good policy. And not that everybody wants to know where every dollar is going, but if a faculty member comes in and wants to look at the books, I'll happily show them, we should not be in the habit of kind of doing things under the table, but in the darkness. This is state money, and anybody at any time can really look into the book. So I just try to get out on it ahead of it. I as chair of mechanical engineering, I used to every year at our fall retreat, I would show we had a lot of our funding was from differential tuition. That tended to be kind of our largest source of money that we could use for different things. And I would just start out and saying, here's how all of it was spent last year. Here's in all the different categories. And honestly, after a few years of that, I started to watch our faculty kind of their eyes glaze over, because they appreciate being shown, but as long as you're open and transparent with them, then a lot of the concerns and things kind of go away. So, are there limits to this policy? I mean, sometimes you have to be a little careful with giving out too much information on some of the details, but in general, transparency is the best policy from my standpoint. I also think it's very important to try to maintain as much equity among faculty and staff, and that can be really challenging, right? So if you're giving some money to one faculty member to be able to travel to a conference, you need to be prepared to give money to every faculty member, to travel to that conference. Unless you have some rules that you're going to apply, maybe you're going to take turns from one year to the next because you can only support so much travel each year. Or maybe the emphasis or the preference, the priority will be to fund tenure track faculty, right? Under the assumption that your more senior faculty should be able to bring in money through research grants, your tenure track faculty need more help in that. So setting policies and communicating those policies to your department, to your college, is can avoid a lot of these problems. So create policies, make sure that the faculty, the staff, they understand what those policies are, and then you stick to those policies and you communicate those policies and you abide by them. That I think is critical for getting this where faculty might think you're showing favoritism. We don't want that to happen. So policies that are accepted and communicated, I think, can help a lot in that aspect.
Alan, we have two questions in the chat. One is related to this, and then we'll go back to the question that you answered before.
Okay.
So regarding limits to transparency, what are some of the details you would be more careful about discussing in budget conversations?
Sometimes when you start getting into salaries and those types of things, that can get a little bit, you got to be a little bit careful with that. Now, we're state employees, so all of our salaries are open records, but there is maybe a little bit of a level of discretion that we want to be careful about when talking one-on-one with a faculty member. Again, when push comes to shove, there's nothing really that we can hide. I mean, there's probably some categories that get into the legal side that we can't discuss. But it's I would say it's more just about being careful and cognizant about how, when we're talking with folks about what we're saying, when it's really dealing with maybe salaries and those types of issues. I'm trying to think of other maybe examples of where I'd be careful. I mean, by and large, I'm for the most part pretty open with what I'm willing to show. If somebody asks me, again, because most of this stuff is open records anyway, and if they really want to find out, they can find out. I don't know, so probably didn't answer the question really well, but you know, it's more just being careful and kind of discretionary when talking about certain items.
So then back to the question that you answered before, you had asked if you had answered it, and the response is answered partly, but additional question: how do we make the case to augment our budget in a bottom-up process and not work with a top-down allotment?
Great question, and really, if we think about it, that's the way it should be done, right? Is we should figure out what is it that we want to do, and what's it going to cost to do that, in terms of education, in terms of research, in terms of service. What's the mission of our program, and what's it going to take for us to meet that mission? And so then we would go about building a budget from the bottom up and say, this is what it's going to cost, and this is what I need. That would be great if we had unlimited funding to be able to provide that, to meet all of those budget requests. The problem is, you know, there may simply not be enough funds to go around for that. And so then we have to make the case is why should my program or my department or my college receive additional funding as an investment so that we can meet this goal? And that's where you've, as a department chair or a dean, have to be able to, I think, be ready to justify is why should you invest to your dean or to the provost? Why should you invest this money to our program? Here's why: because here's the return on investment. Here's going to be the payoff, right? We're going to get these additional enrollments, which are going to then pay for itself, right? This new program we want to start, it's going to pay for itself. It's going to take 3 years to do that, but we have some good data behind it that's going to show that it will eventually generate additional revenue. Then we might be able to redirect some funding from somewhere else, but it's got to come from somewhere else into that program. So as part of this whole process, of course, that we're now going through, this college realignment that we're talking about, department mergers, college mergers, and it's an unsettling process. We know that. But as part of that process, we also want to look at where are those opportunities for investment that really make sense, that are going to pay off. You know, can we start this online program? We think there's a demand for it, and within a couple of years, it's going to be creating more money than what we've invested into it. That's a great investment. So the thing is, you've got to be able to make that case that from an economic standpoint, that it is going to pay off, that we're going to be able to eventually pay back the money, the additional money that we're making to support a new faculty position or some additional adjunct faculty or whatever the case may be. In a budget time where we're cutting, you know, which is what we're doing now, it's awfully difficult. But I've heard President Cook say over and over again that this is not just a time to cut. This is also a time to invest in programs that we think are going to be successful. And so let's think about what those new programs are, what those new opportunities are, and not just think of this as a budget cutting exercise, but it is, let's reimagine how we're doing things and where are those new opportunities, and let's invest in those new opportunities. Hopefully that helped to answer the question there. Last slide, and then we'll still have some time for more additional questions. As we're going through budget cuts right from the state, we need to be thinking about and get creative and innovative about how can we generate new revenue, right? What are those opportunities for us to generate revenue outside the normal channels at a university, meaning outside of tuition revenue, maybe outside of research revenue, but what other opportunities are there to bring in money? Okay, so I've mentioned, for example, recharge centers or service centers, right? And for some certain departments which have equipment that can be used that have value to others across the university or others outside the university, that we can set up these recharge centers to bring in a revenue stream that will pay for the maintenance and the operation of that equipment internally. And if it can be used for external, it can actually also bring in some additional revenue because we can set those rates higher. So are there opportunities for you to make money from the community at large? Summer school is a great way for programs to bring in extra revenue. Again, I mentioned, excess tuition revenues will get returned to the department. So if you have courses that are high demand, especially, general education, service type classes where you might have broader demand across the university, we can make some extra money from summer school. Of course, research grants and contracts, as we raise our research output, not only can we support more graduate students from higher research grants, but we can also, returning indirect costs are additional funds coming into our programs. Other sales and services, for example, in engineering, sometimes we do testing services for local companies because we have unique equipment that others don't have. We have to be careful. We cannot unfairly compete with other local businesses. So we cannot undercut if there are local businesses that provide the same services. We can't undercut those costs, but we can provide kind of specialized testing. Of course, donations, philanthropy, that's going to be a big part of it going forward. And Giving Day yesterday was a great example of where we put a lot of emphasis on the philanthropic support for our programs. And continuing education. And this is something I'll give an example that we're looking at in the College of Business, is to start offering some executive education courses. We can offer workshops for professionals. We're talking about here in the College of Business, a graduate banking academy that local professionals could find value in. And we can set these up so that those professionals are charged a kind of a tuition. This is not academic credit. It can be academic credit, it gets set up that way, but it can be just a kind of an extra certificate that we rely on the faculty expertise to provide educational courses, continuing educational courses to folks in the community. And the money that's brought in, of course, pays for the instruction, but it can also generate some additional revenue to support activities in the college. And so let's get creative about how can we use the talent here within the university. And it plays into our land grant mission of providing education outside the traditional academic undergraduate, graduate setting. So there's a lot of opportunities for different kinds of certificates and so on that can generate additional revenue back to the department, to the college, and to the university. So I think as state funding sources, and this isn't just unique to North Dakota, I mean, this is happening in many states, but as the state funding drops, the portion of the state funding drops, we need to find other sources to backfill that. And so let's get creative. So that's what I had to present, and happy to try to answer any other questions that might pop up.
We have a question related to the bottom up versus top down. It said, what if the historical budget has been inadequate? How is that to be remedied to a new baseline?
So, that's where you've got to make your case to your dean or to the provost that what you're being, and I mean, to be honest, I think we're all feeling a little bit of this right now, as we all seem to be feeling like we're being asked to do more with less. And so I get that, I understand that. And that's where you have to make your case that hey, if we are to continue to offer this program at this level of quality, we're going to need additional revenue. But that's, you know, that's kind of got to be done on a case by case basis. It's going to take your arguments to your superior to be able to make that case, because like as a dean of a college, if one of my department chair comes to me and says, well, I need more money, I'm going to go, well, I don't have any. You know, the only way to make that happen is to take money from here and move it over there. And so where we need to start thinking strategically about where does it make sense to do that? How can I justify moving money out of one program into another? Because as soon as I do that, this program that I just moved money out of is going to say, hey, wait a minute, you know, I need that money too. So the problem that we're constrained with is that our budgets are limited. And so it'd be great if we could just wave a wand and create more money. But I mean, are there cases of inadequate funding support? Yeah, I don't doubt that. We've all been having our departments being cut. We're losing lines, we're losing positions across campus. And so I think we're all kind of feeling that squeeze. I really do. But again, it's going to have to be handled, I think, kind of case by case.
Are there other questions? It popped right up. Thanks, Carrie Ann. Is there a way to account for student retention efforts in the new budget model? Is that an example of making the case for investment with a promise of future return, higher enrollment? Context: departments who have a current low number of primary majors or student credit hours, but have shown significant improvement in retention percentage over the past few semesters.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of those cases where we can show if we're trending, you know, in the right direction on retention. And we've put a lot of emphasis on retention here in this past year, because that's a great way. Every student we save is gonna have, there's gonna be a direct payoff that next year, next semester. And so I think that's one area where we can say, if we're investing in these resources to improve retention, that's going to have a pretty quick return on investment, because that next semester, that next year, we're going to have more money than we would have had we not done this. And so that's a great way, I think, to make the case for some additional investment in areas that are going to have a quick payoff.
Another question: at what level are budgets balanced? Does it go up the hierarchy from department to college to provost and then the university, or is it balanced only at the university level and the intermediate balancing is not relevant?
As a department chair, as a college dean, I have always had to have a balanced budget. I have not, now I'm not saying you can't, and there are situations where you can go into the red a little bit, you know, and sort of float. But eventually that's going to have to be made up. You can't be running a deficit, you know, every year. So I have always, in my years as an administrator, I've never overspent the money that I have available. So the annual budgets have always been balanced, and that can be challenging, and especially when you know, in things like differential tuition, which rise and fall with our enrollments. With the new tuition incentivized budget model, now our budgets will rise and fall with enrollments, with student credit hours, and it's going to be a little more challenging because I don't know exactly next year what I'm going to have for a budget, and so I can project out. But when you're trying to hire people and hire adjuncts or hire staff, it may be that this year you've got enough money, next year you don't. And so it is a challenge projecting out on a year-to-year basis of what's going to be available. But I guess my answer there is, from my perspective, they have to be balanced at the department level, college level, and all the way up. Now, again, depending on the college, there might be a little more, might be a little more of a reservoir that a dean has to be able to make adjustments. And sometimes the deans, say like on distribution of differential tuition, they'll hold a certain percentage back as a cushion in case a department gets in trouble. And so then we can sort of bail out that department because of something that came up, with the understanding though that, okay, in your next allotment, that's going to be paid back. So I think, I mean, that's the way I've always operated, is I'm always working with a balanced budget every year.
We might have time for one more question. If somebody has it, you can unmute or go ahead and put it in the chat. While we wait for that, I want to put in the chat what the Academic Leader Series is. You probably know because you're here. But my email is also there. If you have an idea for a topic that you'd like to hear in the future, you're welcome to email me directly. And then also exciting, you will get an email with a Qualtrics survey. If you wouldn't mind filling it out for academic leaders, that would be great as well. Does anybody else have another question before we wrap today? Okay, I think we're going to call it. Thank you. Yes, wonderful. So thank you, Alan Kallmeyer, the Interim Dean of Business and Managing Budgets. And thank you, everybody, for being here today as well. I hope you have a great rest of the week.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.